You don't want to do video because you could make a YouTube channel and then have people on YouTube check you out.
I could, and then I'd have to edit it, and that'd be a lot. Dr. Kaczor, welcome to Brave New Us.
Thank you. Appreciate being here.
Yeah, so can we start by having you introduce yourself?
Sure. I am a professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount University, and I've been here for 25 years. And I got my PhD from the University of Notre Dame and my undergraduate degree from Boston College. And I've written a bunch of books and articles, and I had the pleasure of teaching you on many occasions. So I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, for a second I thought you were going to say many, many years ago.
Oh, no. Many classes, not very long ago at all.
So your updated edition of The Ethics of Abortion was recently #1 on Amazon. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can you tell us about the book and what are readers going to find in the updated edition?
Yeah, so there's quite a bit actually that's new in the updated edition. So what I've done is take into account the way the argument has evolved and changed over the course of the last 7 years or so. And one of the biggest changes, of course, is the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe. So that is mentioned in the book, but really the book is more focused on the scholarly arguments that were in the literature for the last 7-8 years. And so there's a bunch of different ones, but the two maybe that I want to focus on is one, some new arguments about the use of artificial uteruses. So there has been a discussion in the literature about whether the abortion debate could be solved, as it were, by the use of artificial uteruses. And the basic idea would be that the pro-choice side would be happy that a woman who didn't want to be pregnant would no longer be pregnant. And then the pro-life side would be happy that the human being in utero isn't killed, but rather moved into a early incubation, what would you call it? Like an intensive care unit. And so it would seem, at least on the face of it, that both sides would be happy. So, but it turns out not everyone is happy with that solution. And so I, in the third edition, take on the view of some people that parents have a right to end the life of the young human being, even if it's outside of anyone's body in an artificial uterus. So anyway, I look at that article or that argument. And I look at some other empirical evidence about women who have fetal complications such that the baby is doomed to die. So there are these cases where they can diagnose prenatally that there's some condition the child has that makes it incompatible with life. And then the idea that some people have is it's very compassionate to do an abortion in this situation. And the empirical evidence I looked at, cited from 5 different studies, all came to the same conclusion that women who carried the pregnancy to term and gave birth actually did not regret doing that they actually were very satisfied, despite the tragedy of the situation, that they had continued the pregnancy and moved forward. So that's the kind of thing where if a woman's going to give informed consent, that it seems like that's a relevant consideration that should be brought into the mix. So there's a bunch of other things that I talk about in there, but I'd say those are 2 that I just want to highlight now.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish we had time to dive into each one of those here today. In the book, you do address a number of arguments in favor of abortion to particular limits, such as viability, birth, sentience. I mean, you explain why each of these fails. I'm curious to know which of these arguments you believe is the strongest, and if you could share with us how that also fails to justify abortion.
So what is the strongest of those arguments? I actually think they're all really pretty weak. So it's sort of hard to say who's the strongest. To be like, well, who's the strongest kindergartner? Well, there's probably one that's kind of strong, but kindergartners are really weak in general. So there's not really any that's that strong. I guess the strongest would be this. If you're a utilitarian, then you would hold that sentience, the ability to experience pain, is the morally relevant characteristic for assessing any kind of action. And so if you are a utilitarian, that would be the strongest one. I think that's a problematic one for a number of reasons. And I guess most importantly, I'm not a utilitarian. I think that's a very bad way to think about ethical issues and just issues in general. But B, there are cases of human beings that have chronic insensitivity to pain syndrome. So for those human beings, even after they're born, they can't experience any physical suffering. So cut off their finger, it'd be like you getting a haircut. It doesn't bother them at all. So I think, at the end of the day, appealing to pain also doesn't work very well. But I suppose among all the different ones that people put forward, that might be the strongest of the weakest, if I could say that.
Mm, mhm. Great, thanks. Now, you did mention the overturn of Roe v. Wade, the historic Dobbs decision. We're coming up on the anniversary now as we record. What do you think is in store for the pro-life movement based on what you've seen this past year, based on what you think might be up ahead?
My best guess is that there'll be more ballot initiatives to try to limit abortion. And unfortunately, my best guess is that these initiatives are going to not be successful. And the reason I say that is that there's an enormous financial disparity between those that are supporting abortion and those that are opposed to abortion. Lila Rose from Live Action said it's something like 30 to 1 in terms of the amount spent for abortion versus against abortion. And so I think even though the American people in general are not radically in favor of abortion, I think that there's going to be a lot of advertising and a lot of money spent to try to convince them that the pro-choice side is correct. So what to do about that? I guess it's kind of hard to counter that massive amount of money. So I'm not super optimistic that pro-life people can raise enough money to counter that. But I do think there's more than some hope, a lot of hope in the fact that the pro-life people have the stronger case. So what I mean is that when we actually have conversations about this and debates about this and intellectual exchanges about this topic, I think that it's fair to say that most reasonable people of goodwill can understand the pro-life side of the debate. So that gives me hope that we can move forward. I mean, there are some beliefs that are more difficult to argue based on reason alone. But I think the pro-life belief is actually not very hard to argue for on the basis of reason alone, because the major premise of the pro-life argument that all human beings deserve respect, deserve basic rights, is a premise that in our society, probably 98% of people say they sign on to. So then that leaves us the minor premise that the human newborn, the human fetus, the human embryo is a human being. And a lot of people say they believe in science, and there's lots and lots and lots of scientific evidence supporting the claim that these young human beings are actually members of our species. So if you put those two premises together, you get the pro-life sort of conclusion. So I do think that the basis for this is very, very strong, but it is unfortunate that the other side has a huge PR and financial advantage in terms of, in terms of influencing public opinion.
Right. What about, let's say that 2% who would say, well, human beings, it's not obvious that human beings have any special kind of dignity, where some animals might have more dignity or less dignity, and human dignity itself is just sort of a matter of faith and not reason. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think there are people definitely that hold that. I mean, a very strong animal rights view would say that what matters really is not being human. What matters is, for instance, your ability to suffer. And so what would I say to that view? Well, I would say that there's a grain of truth to it. First of all, it is true that non-human animals deserve a kind of respect. And what I mean by that is there's something seriously wrong with just torturing a cat just for fun, or throwing a dog off a building just to see it splat, or something terrible like that. So we do, and we should respect animals. We shouldn't use them. We shouldn't abuse them. We shouldn't torture them. So all that is something I can definitely sign on to. But it doesn't fall from that we can't acknowledge the dignity of every single human being. And in fact, I think the best way to think about it would be something like this. Different kinds of things have different kinds of natures. So a rock, in virtue of the kind of thing it is not due very much respect at all. And plant deserves more because it's a living thing. And then an animal like a dog or a cat deserves still more because it's living and it's sentient. But then human beings are in a greater category than that. We're not only exist like a rock, not only living like a plant, not only sentient like a dog or a cat, but we also by nature are free and have the ability to reason. Now, I say by nature, and I say that deliberately because obviously there's some human beings that because of a disease like Alzheimer's or because of being very young, like a newborn baby, can't yet reason, or maybe can no longer reason. But that doesn't change the reality that they are in nature rational or are in nature free. In other words, we know that there's a difference between a, say, senior citizen that has Alzheimer's and can't think anymore and a dog, because we say that the senior citizen with Alzheimer's has a disease. There's something getting in the way of what by nature the senior should be able to do. So the very concept of disease or disability or intellectual disability, that presupposes the normative claim that there's different kinds of things that have different kinds of natures. And again, no one takes a dog to a vet and says, I'm very concerned my dog is not talking and it's just really weird. And right, I mean, we know dogs are the kind of thing that don't talk, and cats are the kind of things that don't talk. Whereas if you have a 5-year-old child that doesn't speak yet, parents are extremely alarmed and you get it checked out and you have scans and whatever else. So we use this idea of human beings having a kind of nature all the time in medicine in order to determine, well, what's normal growth and development, what's a disease, what's kind of disability does this person have? And so I think if we have that kind of view, we can say, look, we human beings, all of us, including those with Alzheimer's, including those that are very young, have a shared rational nature. And in virtue of that, we have something that animals, cats and dogs don't have, and plants don't have, and rocks don't have. And so we're due a greater respect than plants and animals and rocks in virtue of having a nature that's greater. We have something that they don't have. So I think there's a rational basis for this. I don't think it's simply a matter of faith that human beings are due a certain kind of respect that is not due to plants, animals, and rocks.
So, what about another kind of intelligent thing? So we have all these developments I'm thinking of in the world of AI right now. We have
Yeah,
AIs that can write poetry and
right.
generate stories and create paintings. And um, what would how does that fit into this argument about rationality and dignity, or does it?
Yeah. So what I would say is that IA machines actually do not have rationality. And let me try to explain why I think that. If you play a song on your iPhone, I would say the right way to think about that is not that your iPhone is singing or your iPhone is playing a guitar, but rather that your iPhone is transmitting the song or the guitar playing of someone else. And similarly with AI devices, they aren't actually thinking. What they're doing is retransmitting the thoughts of the programmers or the patterns, the organization that the programmers have put into it. And so it is amazing that computers are able to do that, but it's really not actually thinking. Just like when your calculator does a calculation properly, you wouldn't say, well, the calculator is really thinking through the math problem accurately. Well, no, it's just that whoever designed the computer or the calculator rather said, if you put this symbol and this symbol together, 2 + 2, this is a symbol that should come out 4. So the calculator is not thinking, oh, 2 + 2 is 4. The calculator is just doing a mechanical operation where these symbols bring about these symbols. And so with AI, the way that it quote unquote writes is not really thinking and writing. What it's doing is just looking over previous texts that human beings have written and representing them in a slightly new way. So again, I would say that's not really writing. It's not really thinking. It appears to be that it imitates that, just like you might say my phone, if it's retransmitting a song, is retransmitting someone else's, ideas, someone else's lyrics, someone else's voice, but it's not really singing. And it's not really playing guitar. It's not really putting forward the song for itself. It's just transmitting the song that someone else made. And so the same thing would be true with IA machines that calculate or that write things. They're just retransmitting, again, the thoughts, ideas of the programmers. And that includes in AI, a scanning of existing texts and retransmitting them. So it's not really thinking at all, I'd say. So therefore, since it's not really thinking, it's not really an individual with a rational nature, and therefore isn't due respect the way other human beings would be due respect.
But what do you think would separate that kind of digesting of material and then regurgitating it from what it is when we say do a research paper or something like that, when we really are, or writing our own poetry? We read somebody else's and we're writing our own. how is that, do you think, different from what the AI is doing?
Well, in some ways they're similar, right? So whenever you write, typically what you're doing is you're taking words that you've heard before and you're putting them in a different sort of order. I guess the difference between real thinking and real AI has to do in part with the fact that a real conversation is able to go in places that are unexpected and lead to things that you wouldn't think of at all before. Whereas with AI, it seems pretty clear that uh, there's a kind of trail that they're on, and they're unable to circle back and reflect on what they've said. Because in other words, I don't think there's any reflection at all, right? In other words, what they're doing isn't thinking, it's just representing things. Whereas I think with human beings, we really can actually think. I mean, you can
Mhm.
pause and stop and consider something. And I'm sure you've done this in conversations I have many times where someone will say something to me and I'm all of a sudden go, oh yeah, yeah, I guess you're right. I think I have to take that back and I have to circle around, and that changes my thinking in a certain way. So yeah, I would say that that's a fundamental difference between actual human thought and what the AI is doing.
Mm,
But as AIs get better, I think it will be the case that it'll be harder and harder to differentiate them. But even if it becomes impossible to differentiate them, I don't think that would show that actually the same thing is going on.
mhm,
So go back to the idea of the iPod. So I made an argument that the iPod's not actually singing. It's just transmitting the song in another. But then you say, well, what if you program the iPod so that it takes a little bit of this song, a little bit of that song, and it basically splices together, 20 songs or 100 songs or 1,000 songs? Well, even if it's spliced together every song that is ever recorded, it still isn't singing. I mean, all it's doing is taking all these different songs. So it's just different in kind than an actual person singing.
mhm. There's not actual generation happening.
Right. Right. And there's not actual understanding happening either. So here's another way to think of it. One difference between what we do and what a computer does has to do with a concept, or has to do with the first act of the mind, that is understanding. So when we understand what it is to be human, say, that involves our mind grasping onto the concept of what it is to be human. Whereas a computer doesn't have that first act of the mind of grasping what it is to be human. What it has is a series of ones and zeros that it kind of puts together in the code to generate whatever it generates. So there is no initial act of understanding to start with. So what a computer can do, though, is once you have like human beings are irrational animals and you have Samantha as a human being, well, then the computer can put that together and generate the conclusion that Samantha is a human being. So you can have a kind of logic that computers can use, but the logic is neutral, or you might say, with respect to understanding. In other words, it just is a series of symbols that that and in the symbols there is no understanding of what the symbol means. It's just the symbol that as a kind of empty placeholder, and then it can manipulate those empty placeholders, but again, there's no understanding going on there, just a manipulation of the empty placeholders.
It seems like you could also maybe tell the difference if you were to generate, you know, a million false articles and put that
Yeah,
into the sample that
right.
the AI was working with. The AI would have to rely on that unless it was programmed not to, whereas a human being could look at that and probably say, oh, we're going to rule these out because this is gibberish or something like that.
Yeah, that's right.
Would
So
be able
my
to see that.
understanding of how these AI, like the chatbot, what is it called? I
Chat
forget.
PG something
Yeah, exactly. So my
letters.
understanding of that is that it basically does exactly what you said. It scans, millions and millions of texts out there online already, and then from the scanning, calls what it takes to be the right answer. But the problem with that is exactly what you said. If you've got millions and millions of texts out there, okay, there's a good chance that there's a bias in that sample, right? So why does the chatbot tend to tilt politically? Is it because this is really rational? Well, no, I wouldn't say that. It's because there's more text out there that
Mm.
suggests this view is correct. And so when it's scanning around, it's like, okay, well, this seems to be the majority view. But we know from philosophy that the majority view is not necessarily true. And in fact, we know from science that every new scientific discovery that's made, there's only one person or maybe a handful of people in the whole world who know it's true, that, whatever it is, the new scientific development. So we can't determine the truth by a scan of existing texts online and say, well, this must be true. I mean, that's
Right.
incredibly naive.
Right, right. Well, thank you. Let's circle back to the artificial wombs
Sure.
and this idea that they could potentially eliminate the need for abortion. Can you share your thinking on the permissibility of artificial wombs and their potential applications?
Yeah, I've written about this before, and the basic idea is that there's a number of pro-choice speakers like David Boonin, like Judith Jarvis Thompson, like Marianne Warren, who have said things like, well, if you could do an abortion without killing the fetus, that would be better. And it would obviously be better from a political standpoint, because if you could do that, the number of people who would object to abortion would plummet. In fact, I'm not sure I can think of anyone really who thinks abortion is wrong for any other reason than that it's intentionally killing a human being prior to birth. So if you don't have that anymore, what would be wrong with it? And you might say it's unnatural. Well, there's lots of things we do to the human body that aren't normally happening to the human body, if that's what you mean by natural. I mean, getting hearing aids for old people or getting eyeglasses for people that don't see well, or there's all kinds of things, and that's fine. So I don't think there's anything in itself wrong with this any more than there'd be something in itself wrong with a woman getting a C-section towards the end of her pregnancy when she hasn't, she's past her due date and is not going into labor. And the doctors might say, well, look, your due date's passed and, we're going to do a C-section. Now, is that natural? Well, it's not the typical way women give birth, but there's nothing evil or wrong about that. It's not unnatural in the sense of morally wrong. So I think that would be morally acceptable to many pro-choice people, not all, and then to many pro-life people, but not all. And so if it's acceptable to many pro-choice people and many pro-life people, if those groups are big enough, well, then you'd have a situation where, yes, there might be a few outliers who still object. Some pro-choice people say, no, abortion is the right to kill the fetus. There'd be some people who think that. And then some pro-life people say, no, pregnancy has to last 9 months, otherwise there's some moral problem with it. There'd probably be some people to think that. But if you can get most of the other people in the debate to say, yeah, no, that sounds good, then it seems like we have a solution for the abortion debate. Now, the solution raises itself new problems. So here's a couple of those. One would be, you could imagine clearly illegitimate uses of this, like in Star Wars, where they make a clone army, right? So obviously that would be an illegitimate use of that. And I do think that's illegitimate. So my view, at least, wouldn't be like, use artificial wombs whenever you want, just, make the clone army do it, anything like that. I would say that it should be a little bit like adoption is now. So is it wrong to, have a pregnancy and then you place the child for adoption with another family? I would say, well, that's not intrinsically evil. That's not like wrong to do in all cases at all times. But is it something that you should do only in circumstances where, the other options are not very good? I'd say, yeah. In other words, there's something problematic if someone just gives birth like, well, it just would be a hassle to raise this kid, so I'm just going to place the kid for adoption. Like, well, no, it's a serious thing. And, generally there's a prima facie idea that if you have a child, you should raise the child yourself. But it's a kind of prima facie duty that can be overridden by other considerations. So similarly with artificial wombs, I wouldn't want to see it to be used in a very casual way, like, oh, whatever, I got pregnant, every other month for 5 years, and I've got all these kids in the artificial womb out there. Like, that seems like problematic. But on the other hand, it seems much less problematic to do that than to get an abortion. So I think one last thing about the artificial womb, I'm a little less optimistic about the hopes of it being acceptable to both sides, because as artificial wombs have become more likely to happen, I have read more pro-choice people that are criticizing them and saying that this is bad and we need abortion understood as the right to end the life of the child. And so it could be that maybe I was too optimistic initially about the pro-choice side of the ledger being satisfied with this sort of view. So anyway, we'll see what happens. My understanding, though, is that scientists are working on this, and I haven't heard any updates recently about how far along they are, but I read something, maybe it was 5 or 10 years ago, that said within 5 or 10 years this would be a possibility. So maybe the scientists saying that we're overly optimistic, but I do think in 50 years, I think, down the road, I think it probably will happen.
What about the potential use of artificial wombs as an alternative to surrogacy?
Yeah, that's something I haven't really thought about. So I find surrogacy problematic, in part because, well, I would say surrogacy is different than what I'm talking about with artificial wombs. And the reason is
Mhm.
this. When I'm talking about artificial wombs, what I'm talking about is a case where someone is already pregnant. There is already existing this human being. And then the debate is, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to use abortion? Will we remove this human being and put this human being into an artificial womb? And that's a different scenario than surrogacy. So surrogacy happens when there's no child in existence yet. And then a couple says, hey, we can't have a baby together naturally. So what we'll do is we will hire somebody else and we'll get the sperm and eggs in a lab. We'll do in vitro fertilization. Then we'll take the embryo and implant it in this woman outside the lab. But that whole process takes place prior to any human being being in existence to start with. So in other words, you're deliberately from the very outset, before there's a human being in existence, making it so that this human being is not going to be raised by biological parents, or not raised, gestated, or conceived, gestated, and raised by their biological parents. So that's a very different scenario than making the best out of a situation, given that there's a human being already in existence.
So, your home state of California recently introduced legislation that appears to legalize infanticide in the case of botched abortions. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I haven't read that legislation, so I'm not sure exactly what's going on there. I guess it would be something like that there's no legal responsibility uh, to resuscitate a botched abortion. So it does happen. You're right that an abortion can go wrong. So the abortionist tries to do the abortion, but then fails to kill the child in utero, and then the child's born alive.
Mhm.
And since a child in the United States is born alive, would be just as much a person as a child who wasn't the result of a botched abortion. So I actually don't know whether the current California law is compatible with the laws about murder in the United States. I just don't know whether that's compatible. That I guess there's a possibility that it could be compatible in this way. You could say, well, there's not an obligation to always provide life support for everyone in need of life support. And so maybe the idea is something like, well, if the woman obviously doesn't want this child to continue living, and then the child's born injured after the abortion, but still alive, well, there's no obligation to take extraordinary measures to keep the child alive. Maybe that's the sort of argument that the law can make, but I haven't looked at that in detail, so I'm not exactly sure what the law is requiring or forbidding.
Okay. In your work, you've also addressed so-called post-birth abortion. Can
Yeah.
you explain to listeners what a post-birth abortion is, what arguments are being made to justify them, and how do we respond?
Yeah, so there's a lot of philosophers, a number of them, who have argued in favor of infanticide, or what other philosophers call post-birth abortion. So the basic idea is that the right to choose abortion should not end during gestation or end at birth, but rather should extend later. And the argument that's given for this, one of them, is that there's no moral difference between a fetus and a newborn. Like intellectually and physically, there's no real significant difference. And so neither one, according to this view, would be a person in the morally relevant sense. So the idea, therefore, would be something like this, that because neither one's a person, the same reasons that would justify abortion would also justify post-birth abortion or infanticide. So this argument was put forward most famously by a pair of bioethicists named Gio Bellini and Minerva. And what they said was basically that until a human being is aware that she exists and desires to continue existing, until those two conditions are met, the human being in question is not a person, and therefore doesn't have a right to life, and therefore the parents can end that child's life. Now you might ask yourself, well, when do these two characteristics come into existence? Namely, when is it that human beings realize they're alive and value their own existence? Well, psychologists point to something called the mirror test to determine whether a human being has self-awareness. And the mirror test is basically if you put a little dot or a little cross on a child's forehead and they look in a mirror, do they recognize that as themselves, or do they think it's another child? So think about a dog seeing in a mirror another itself will think it's another dog. And little kids, like 1-year-olds, if they see their own image in a mirror with a little mark on their head, they think it's another child. But once you have self-awareness, which for human beings comes around the age of 2, then you look in the mirror and you say, aha, that's me. And you say, well, why is there a mark on my head? So for human beings on average, it's around the age of 2 that you gain self-awareness and you realize that you exist. And so if their view is correct, what you'd say is that post-birth abortion or infanticide or killing of children ought to be permissible until about the age of 2. So for some children, maybe younger, maybe they're self-aware at 1 year and 9 months or something. Other children, developmentally delayed children, might not be self-aware until 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, but basically for most human beings around the age of 2. I think that is a reductio ad absurdum. I think that's an absurd conclusion. So that's one of the reasons I reject their view. But there's lots of other reasons to reject their view too. And I think maybe the most prominent is this idea that they have that in order to be harmed, you have to experience this as a harm. In other words, in order for you or I to be harmed, the idea is we have to value whatever it is in question and value the harm that comes to us if we lose that. So like, think of my watch. I have this watch on and I value my watch. So if someone steals my watch, well, then I'm harmed. And I experience that as a harm. But if I didn't know I had a watch and someone took my watch, I wouldn't be harmed because I wouldn't experience that as a harm. So I don't think that argument works very well for a number of reasons. First is that there's many ways we can be harmed, and yet we don't experience it as a harm. So let me give you an example. If a nuclear bomb were to go off right now, where I'm sitting, I would be completely pulverized. I would instantly, be a bunch of atoms and molecules. So it would happen so fast, the speed of light, that I wouldn't experience that as a harm. I just go from talking to you and feeling fine to just not existing anymore. But it seems very obvious that if you kill me in a painless and instant way like that, it's clearly true that you harm me. So that means it's not necessary for me to experience something as a harm for me to actually be harmed. Or to take a different example, if you did a lobotomy on a 1-year-old child and made it so that their mind never developed past the age of 1, did you harm the child? I think clearly you did. Did the child experience it as a harm? Did the child say, oh my gosh, you scrambled my brains, now I'm harmed? No. So you can harm someone even though they don't experience it as a harm. So their account, I think, really doesn't work very well. Here's another. So I think there's a bunch of reasons that we should reject their account, but those are just a couple of them. In my book, I talk about a lot more reasons to reject it, but just for the sake of time, we'll stick with just a couple.
Right. What if they said, if you were blown up by the nuclear bomb,
Yeah.
you aren't harmed because you're not experiencing it, but it's only maybe the people who would miss you that are harmed, but you actually aren't harmed.
Yeah, so if you kill like a homeless guy in a quick and painless way, and no one's going to miss the homeless guy because his family, is not in contact with him, then you've harmed no one.
Yeah, is that the
or if you destroy everyone on planet Earth, since there'll be no one around to miss you, you haven't harmed anyone. So as long as you kill enough people, you don't harm anyone.
that's kind of what it seems like.
Yeah,
the argument is.
That seems hard to believe, to me at least, that killing everyone on Earth would count as no harm to anyone on Earth.
Yeah, it doesn't really work.
Yeah, I don't think it works. I don't think it works. There's other problems with their view too. So just one more problem I'll mention is, according to Giablini and Minerva, you, quote unquote, you only come to existence at around the age of 2. And the reason they hold that is that what you are, according to them, is your thoughts, beliefs, desires, etc. So they have this view of the person that is sometimes called body self dualism. So the real me is my thoughts, beliefs, desires, etc. The real you are your thoughts, beliefs, desires, etc. But like my flesh and blood, my body, that's not really me at all. It's a little bit like a vehicle I'm driving around in. So if someone, throws an egg at my car, well, they didn't really harm me, they just harmed my car. Now, I reject that kind of anthropology. I think that's confused and doesn't work well at all to explain the reality of who we are as humans. And this example might help clarify it. So imagine I have multiple personality syndrome. So there's sometimes I'm Christopher Kaczor, philosophy professor. Sometimes I'm Hoist Gracie, the jujitsu master. Sometimes I'm Jacques, the French chef. And imagine these are just 2 or 3 totally different personalities, right? One only speaks Portuguese, one only speaks French, and then I only speak English. And let's say you're a doctor and you come along and say, I'm going to cure you. And so you give me the psychological or the psychiatric treatment. And now my multiple personality order goes away. Jacques is gone. Hoist, the jiu-jitsu guy, is gone. All that's left is Chris. Well, my way of viewing that would be to say that you've cured me. But if you took this body self-dualism view seriously, you'd have to say, well, you destroyed 2 persons. You destroyed Jacques, you destroyed Hoist. So you should be charged with murder, double murder, actually.
Yeah, well, it seems.
Was that?
It seems like that is the pervasive view of who we are as human beings. That's certainly appearing in the media, for example, or
That's right.
It's all over TikTok.
Yeah, that's right.
They are having these multiple personality TikTok, celebrities that are flaunting these personalities like that and saying, this is who I am.
Yeah. And I think that is, with real multiple personality disorder, it is a disorder, right? In other words, and the idea isn't just that, in other words, what I do, I'm not meaning this. I'm not meaning that each one of us as an individual acts or behaves in different contexts in different ways, right? Because if you go play softball, it is time to play softball. It's not time to do your taxes when you're on second base or something. So yes, we have different parts of ourselves that we use or reveal at different times. That's perfectly normal. What I'm talking about is someone who has 3 different personalities, such that Jacques doesn't even know Chris exists, Hoist doesn't know Jacques exists, and there's 3 independent lines of memory, thought, belief, desire, no integration. Whereas in a real person, yeah, you might be on stage one day singing a song, and then the next day you're doing gardening, and the next day you're doing a podcast. But I mean, you in all 3 contexts are aware of the other ways you're expressing yourself at different times and places. So you don't have multiple personality disorder. And I do think that it's widely recognized it as a disorder. But here's another reason to think that this whole view, this body self-dualism view, is problematic. Many actions we do, if you say, well, I taste the sandwich I ate, or I see the sandwich that I'm about to eat, or I smell the sandwich that I'm eating, that involves our senses, right? There's no such thing as seeing unless you have eyes. There's no such thing as tasting unless you have a mouth. There's no smelling without a nose. So to do those activities, you need a body. So if I say, I see the cup, well, that I need a body to see, because I need eyes and an ocular nerve, etc. And then with thinking, you say, well, I think that this cup is going to be filled with water and it's good for me to drink the water. But it's the very same eye that sees that also is thinking about it. So the idea somehow that I am not a body, or that I'm just this mind or just this thought, is incompatible with the reality that I see things, I taste things, I touch things. Those are all bodily acts. So I don't think this body self-dualism view really, at the end of the day, is very philosophically compelling. I don't think it really works to